Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another book review. And today we are going to be reviewing one of my favorite collections of novellas. We're going to be taking a look at Stephen King's 4 Past Midnight. I have it in the Johnny Depp movie cover paperback edition. And I also have it in the original hardcover edition. And so this collection was published in 1990. I'm going to check that to make sure that is correct. Published in 1990. The hardcover clocks in at 763 pages. And this particular paperback copy clocks in at 744 pages, although it does have a sneak preview of needful things at the end of this book, so there's a little bit of that at the end. So this is one of Stephen King's collection of 4 novellas, just like he did with Different Seasons, and just like he did with, make sure I'm going to tell you the right book. No, it wasn't this one. Just like he did with the other one that I can't remember off the top of my head, the one that had 1922 in it. This is a collection of 4 not quite novels, but too long to be short stories. And this is my favorite of his. This is my favorite one of his that he's put together, even more so than Different Seasons, even though that has Shawshank and Apt Pupil in it, and The Body. This is my favorite of the ones that he did. So let's get into it and talking about the novellas in this book. And I'm not going to give all the secrets away, so if you're looking for an extreme spoiler video, this isn't going to be it. But I'm going to tell you what I thought about each one of them and whether or not I thought they were worth reading and what I rated them. So the first book that we get, first novella that we get, 1 Past Midnight as it were, is a story called The Langoliers. And I will just say off the top that that is my favorite out of all 4. The Langoliers is my favorite story. And The Langoliers is a story about Brian Engel. He is a pilot, and he gets noticed that his ex-wife has passed away. So he gets on a plane, the red eye, going from Los Angeles to Boston. And he gets on a plane, a full passenger load of plane to go across the country to attend a funeral. And he happens to fall asleep, as do a couple of other people on the plane. And when Brian wakes up, and when the other passengers that fell asleep on the plane wake up, they realize that everybody else on the plane has disappeared. They're all gone. Everyone, including the pilot and the co-pilot and the stewardesses, the hostesses. They're all gone. The plane is on autopilot, barreling to Boston, and there's no one except the half a dozen people that were sleeping when what they call the event occurred. So then Brian and the rest of the passengers have to figure out what happened, what's going on, why is everybody gone, and what is wrong with the world around them. Because the world around them is still there, it's just slightly different. And so Brian winds up landing the plane, taking over the plane from the autopilot and landing the plane not in Boston, but in Maine. They land in an airport in Maine, and then they have to figure out what in the hell is going on and how they can fix what's going on. I will say this is a science fiction story. This is a time travel story. Stephen King's idea of time travel in this book is very interesting. It's not like your typical time travel idea story. His thoughts on time travel were very specific to this novel, and they were very interesting. I found them to be very, very interesting. A lot of people have said that Stephen King cannot write science fiction, and they say that based on his longer works, such as Tommyknockers, Dreamcatcher, Under the Dome. And those are valid concerns. So what I say to people who say that Stephen King can't write science fiction is this. Stephen King can't write long science fiction, bloated science fiction. But his science fiction short stories and his science fiction novellas tend to be a lot better. Why? Because Stephen King has always worked better, and I will defend this. He's always worked better in the smaller, in the shorter, in the high and tight category. When he has a smaller canvas to work on, when he's crafting a short story or a novella, he doesn't have the room like he does in his big books. He doesn't have the room to ramble. He doesn't have. He's got to tell a story. It's got to be good. It's got to be tight. You got to cut out all the fat. You got to tell a nice, tight, focused story. And I think that's why his shorts and his novellas tend to be better, because he doesn't have the time or the space or the ability to ramble, to go off on tangents, to write things that may or may not have anything to do with the overall arch of the story he's trying to tell. And that happens in those three big books that I just mentioned, and I think that's why people tend to get turned off on Stephen King science fiction. But stick with his shorts, stick with his novellas. They're a lot better. So, The Langoliers is a great story. It's got a wonderful cast of characters. It's really tight. It's really focused. It's laser focused on the event. What happened? Why did it happen? And how can they fix it? And it's really well done. It actually spawned a really well done, in my opinion, well done television miniseries. Minus the poor CGI that was in the miniseries, but that's more of a product of its time because that happened in the 90s than anything else. But the miniseries was really good. And if you haven't seen The Langoliers, I would watch it. It has one of my favorite actors in it. It has Bronson Pinchot in it. My boy from Perfect Strangers, so that's another plus for me. But The Langoliers was a wonderful story, and it was a great way to start this collection. I gave it, it's a 5 out of 5. It is my favorite out of all, and it's wonderful. 2 Past Midnight. That would be Secret Window, Secret Garden. That is a story about an author, recently divorced author named Morton Rainey, who's living, he was living in Derry, and he's living in a cabin in another town. Was it Tashmore Lake? Yeah, it might have been. And he's a fairly well-published author. Gets a knock on the door one day at his cabin, and it's a man named John Shooter. And John Shooter tells him what every author doesn't want to hear. He says, "You stole one of my stories. You stole one of my stories. You plagiarized one of my stories, and I want it back, and I want you to fix what you did." And so the rest of this story is Morton Rainey trying to figure out what this John Shooter is talking about. Why does he think that I stole one of his stories? How could this have possibly happened? And he's trying to figure out where this guy is coming from. I will say off the top of the bat that Morton Rainey is an extremely unreliable narrator. I do like that in stories. I like the unreliable narrator because it always keeps you on your toes, always keeps you guessing. And so that's the whole plot of the book, is that Morton Rainey is trying to figure out why John Shooter thinks that, and John Shooter keeps coming back and telling him, and he gets more threatening and more threatening and more threatening as the story goes on, and what's he going to do about this problem and this predicament that he has with this guy from Sticksville or wherever he's from, right? Now, the theme of this story, Stephen King has touched on this theme a lot of times in other books of his, right? This idea of when the line between fiction and reality start to blur and start to bleed into each other. He's talked about that quite a bit in other books of his. For example, he talked about that in Misery, right? When the line between fantasy and fiction starts to blur for the reader, for Annie Wilkes, and what happens when the reader can't tell the difference between fantasy or fiction and reality. He talked about it in The Dark Half when Thad Beaumont was writing under a pseudonym, and he decided that he wasn't going to write under that pseudonym anymore, so he killed off the pseudonym. But the pseudonym, the fiction that he created, started to develop a life of its own and came back and said, "I don't want to be killed." And so what happens when your fiction starts to take on a life of its own, and the line between your fiction and reality start to blur? And in this book, Secret Window, Secret Garden, he explores what it means when the line between fiction and reality starts to blur for the writer. So he's explored that theory, that theme, over and over again. Thank God this is really the last time he explores that theme, because I think he's explored it enough. The story was good. The story is predictable. About halfway through, you're going to figure it out. You're going to know how this story is going to end. There's really no twists and turns. There's really no surprise endings. It's not bad. It was not my favorite of the collection. It was a decent story, but again, it was predictable. It was rote. You knew where it was going, especially folks that have ever watched Fight Club. You're going to know where Secret Window, Secret Garden, maybe that should have been a spoiler. I don't know, but you'll figure it out. You're going to know where Secret Window, Secret Garden is coming from. So it's not bad. Like I've always said, Stephen King on his worst days is oftentimes better than people on their best days, other people on their best days. But it wasn't my favorite. I would say it was somewhere between a 3 and a 4, just because it's predictable. You know how it's going to end. And out of the 4, that was my least favorite of all of them. 3 Past Midnight is a story called The Library Policeman. I do appreciate library-themed horror. There needs to be more library-themed horror in the world. I don't know I don't know what else is out there. I'm sure if there are other library-themed horror stories, people will let me know. But I do appreciate a good library or librarian-themed horror novel or short story or novella. And so we had The Library Policeman, and this was a tough one for me to sort of wrap my head around. This is a story about Sam Peebles, and he lives in Iowa. I think it's Iowa. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Iowa. Not Idaho, Iowa. And he works in insurance. Yeah, I should know these things because I just read this book. And he has to write a speech for a Rotary presentation, and he has to give a speech, and he writes his speech, and he has somebody read the speech, and he says, how do you think it is? And they look at it, and they say, well, it's pretty good, but it needs to be punched up. Maybe you can go find some books that will tell you how to punch up the story. Why don't you go to your library? Go to your local library and get some books that will teach you how to make your speech more exciting. So he does. He goes to the library, and he meets the librarian, Ardelia Lortz, or what he thinks is the librarian, Ardelia Lortz. And she's very weird, and the library is very strange. He's very uncomfortable in the library. And she lets him borrow 2 books, and she says, you make sure these books come back on time. You make sure they come back on time, because if they don't come back on time, we're going to send the library policeman after you. And as you can guess, he takes them home, and whoopsie-daisy, he loses the books. Here comes the library policeman, and the story takes a weird left-hand twist down the left-hand side. It takes a shift. And then it goes off into what is Sam going to do now that Ardelia and the policemen are after him, rather violently are after him. And I didn't know really how to wrap my head around this book, and I didn't know really how to rate it or what to think of it until I got to the end of the book, and I realized, a little light bulb went off on top of my head, and I realized that I believe, and people can quote me, can correct me, or maybe they have other opinions on this, but I believe that The Library Policeman is a Dark Tower adjacent book, and I'll tell you why. Because the similarities between Ardelia Lortz and Pennywise are glaringly obvious. And if Ardelia Lortz is not the same species as Pennywise, then she's at least a distant cousin, or she's an offshoot of whatever species Pennywise is, because the similarities between the two of them are extremely close. They both feed off the fear of children. And here's some spoiler alerts if you haven't read it yet, but I'm going to get into a little spoilery territory. They both feed off the fear of children. Pennywise eats the children. Ardelia drinks their tears, gets them frightened enough and drinks their tears. They're both shapeshifters. Pennywise is a well-known shapeshifter. Ardelia Lortz and the library policeman, same thing. So she's also a shapeshifter. And they're both cyclical. Pennywise comes back every 27 years. Ardelia Lortz comes back 30 years. And the only real difference, and it's not really a difference, is that Ardelia Lortz also, she reproduces, so she becomes other people, other hosts. If you remember in It, Pennywise was also reproducing because Pennywise was laying eggs. Remember at the end, they found out the nest and there were eggs in there. So Pennywise was also reproducing. So the similarities between those two creatures are way too close for me not to believe that they're not, if they're not the same kind of creature, the same species, then they're extremely similar, which means they both come from Toadash space, which means they both come from the Macroverse, which means they both come from the Dark Tower universe, which makes the Library Policeman a Dark Tower adjacent book and story. And once I figured that out, my appreciation of that story went up immensely. And I went, aha, that's it. The story itself isn't bad. The Dark Tower connection, even better. I would give it a solid 5. I think it's quite a good book. There are some things in it that are very, very hard to read. I believe this is the first time. I don't think he's ever touched on this subject before in other books or stories. This may be the first time that we have graphic depictions or he talks about child rape. So there's a trigger warning for anybody going into this book that is in there. It's handled very well. It's handled very delicately. It's handled with kid gloves, and I think it's handled very well. When it happened, though, it took me a little bit back because I don't think he's ever really explored that topic in that fashion. So that is in there for anybody, for this little trigger warning for folks. But other than that, it was a solid story. It was a great connection, a great villain, good characters, real good action. So I give that a 5 out of 5. And 4 Past Midnight, the final book in the series, final novella in the collection, was The Sundog. And oddly enough, this is a story that takes place in Castle Rock. So in addition to getting a 4 Past Midnight review, you're also getting another stop on my ill-fated Castle Rock tour that I never did finish. But here we are, back in the Rock, talking about a Castle Rock story. The Sundog is actually a bit of a prequel story to the Needful Things. But you can read The Sundog on its own. It's a story about a kid. Wow, for the life of me, I can't remember the kid's name. I think his name is Kevin. This is really sad, right? Because it is Kevin. Kevin Delavan. I just read the book. I forgot the kid's name already. Kevin Delavan, on his 15th birthday, gets a Polaroid, gets a camera. Polaroid Sun 660. For his birthday because he wants to get into photography, and he's really excited, except for one problem. The Polaroid only takes one picture. The same picture. Over and over and over and over and over again. No matter what you point at it, it takes the same picture. Except it's not really the same picture. It's the same point in time picture, and each picture slowly changes until eventually he realizes that the picture, there's a dog in the picture. And there's a white fence in the picture. And it's almost like a flip book, like an animated cartoon, because each picture advances the scene just a little bit. And so he realizes that this is a camera taking a picture of a specific point in time in a specific place with a specific dog. And that dog, a supernatural dog perhaps, is trying to get out of the camera. So he takes the camera, and this is where we get to find out about Pop Merrill, the owner of the Emporium Galorium, the uncle of Ace Merrill, who will wind up being a prominent figure in Needful Things. This is Pop Merrill's story. They touch a little bit on it in Needful Things, but we get to hear about Pop Merrill's story. And so Kevin takes it to Pop and says, "I think I should destroy it." And of course, Pop, being what he is, He makes plans to steal the camera from the kid, to switch it with another camera so that Kevin thinks he's destroyed the camera because he wants to sell it. He thinks he can turn a profit on it. He thinks he can make a buck off of it from people. And he tries, and it doesn't really work. And then now they have to figure out what the heck are we going to do with this camera, because if you keep taking pictures with the camera, the dog is going to come out of the pictures. They're afraid that the dog is going to come out of the camera and out of the pictures. And if the dog comes out, what's going to happen? Is they're going to start killing people. And as you know, Castle Rock has a bad track record with dogs. Cujo. They don't have a good track record with dogs in The Rock. So I'd be very careful, if I were you, about taking pictures of this weird dog with your camera, because we know what happens to dogs in Castle Rock. So it wasn't a bad story. It can be read on its own. You don't have to read Needful Things to really understand anything that's going on. It builds slowly. There's a frenetic bit of action towards the end. You get to hear, really, the reason to read it, I think, is you really get to hear about Pop's backstory. You get to hear about Pop Merrill and this weird supernatural camera. So it's not terrible. I did rather enjoy it. I would give it a 4 out of all. I think it's not on the level of, say, the Langoliers, but it's not on the level of Secret Window, Secret Garden. I still enjoyed it, but I think there are other offerings in this collection that are better, so I would give it a 4. But overall, as a whole, I gave the entire collection a 5 on Goodreads, because I think it's good. I think it's one of his better collections. I think it's one of his better sets of novellas. I think they're well done. They're well crafted. The ideas are really good. The characters are well fleshed out. The action is well done. And I really enjoyed it. Everything was high and tight. There was little to no bloat or fat. And I appreciate reading Stephen King's short works and shorter novellas, because I think you're getting a richer story, a better story, a more finely crafted story than some of his longer books. Like I said at the beginning, because I don't think he doesn't have the time to ramble in these short stories. He just has to hit the ground running and get you a story from end to end. And that laser focus really makes for better crafted stories. So guys, that is my review of Stephen King's 4 Past Midnight. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I think it's well worth your time. It's well worth a read. It's well worth putting in your collection. It's one of his better stories. So go check it out, pick it up, and see if you like it. So guys, that is my review of Stephen King's book. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe. Pass it around. Tell your friends. Tell your enemies. Tell whoever wants to listen. But please don't tell any dogs, because we don't need weird supernatural dogs coming over here, because I don't have cameras or things to stop them. So guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I will see you in the next video.